So it's my pleasure and to welcome Father Isidoros Katsos, who we'll see has considerable competence in this area, as we'll see during this lecture. Interesting from many points of view, and it'll give continuity to this session as well. He did his doctoral studies with Professor Rowan Williams, so it's a connection there, and I'm sure different things will come out. And at the present moment in the University of Oxford, he's working in the Faculty of Theology and Religion in a postdoctoral studies, which he's continuing with. Beforehand, he studied a lot of other areas, a lot of other things, not only theology, but also philosophy of religion and law and different areas of university endeavor. Now, shortly, if I'm not mistaken, he will be going to Athens to take up a position there, also in the area of theology. As regards publications, well, several publications: Metaphysics in the Light of the Hexameral Literature, from Philo of Alexandria to Gregory of Nyssa, and also Oxford Early Christian Studies, different elements there. So you're very welcome. Looking forward to hearing you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, fantastic, thank you. So, let me start by expressing my gratitude to Father Giulio for organizing this intellectual feast and for generously inviting me to take part in it, and to Father Thomas Joseph for offering us a book that is a pure intellectual delight to read, despite its daunting size. When Father Giulio invited me to talk about the book, he kindly suggested that I explore its impetus for ecumenical dialogue between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. So, the Trinity from an ecumenical perspective. That is the subject matter of my talk. If only it were a simple task. Before reading the book, I thought that Eastern and Western theologians had somehow reached a gentleman's agreement, that the insertion of the Filioque clause in the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed had happened sometime somewhere in the wild, wild West, namely at the local council of Toledo in 589. Now, building on an honest misunderstanding, the Latin Church gradually added to the initial statement of the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, according to which the Spirit proceeds from the Father, ek tou patros, that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, ex patre filioque. In the absence of an ecumenical council that would settle the issue, the creedal addition became the thorniest issue of theological contention between East and West. Things, however, took a new turn during the 20th century when the Pope and the Ecumenical Patriarch decided that the new rapprochement was desirable and possible. Since then, Eastern theologians have showed willingness, for the first time in centuries, to quiet down their concerns about the Filioque as unwarranted speculation, if not falsification, of the Trinitarian doctrine of the Church Fathers. In exchange, they saw their Western colleagues quieting down their own normative claims about the theological necessity of the Filioque. The general sentiment in the theological schools, at least in the East, was that the Filioque had relocated from the sphere of theology to the sphere of history and culture, an infelix culpa that shaped Eastern and Western Christianity as religious communities, a historic misunderstanding, if you will, of historical proportions. Historical, but not doctrinal. That seemed to be the major shift achieved in the last century. After reading the book, however, the reader might think that we are about to return to the previous state. The book namely argues that the Filioque is not just an accident of history, something that could have happened or not, but the only correct interpretation of the Nicene faith. In the words of the author, when the Father spirates the Spirit from all eternity, he necessarily does so as Father of the Son, and so also in the Son and with the Son. Quote again, as to the historically contested question of the filioque, there are many scriptural and traditional bases in favor of its affirmation. In addition, Aquinas affirms it as a necessary component of Trinitarian theology, end quote. If the argument of the book is correct, it has serious impact on the ecumenical dialogue. It suggests that regardless of what happened in Toledo in the 6th century, Christian theologians in East and West ought to understand the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed as entailing that the third person of the Trinity always proceeds from the other two together. To put it more pointedly, if the argument of the book is correct, the Orthodox rejection of the filioque must betoken a failure to grasp something true and important about the life of the Trinity. Clearly, the resurgence of the filioque as a normative claim poses a genuine challenge for the Orthodox reader. If the filioque is the correct Trinitarian doctrine, what room is there left for the Orthodox contrary position? In the past, in situations like this, an Orthodox theologian would consider whether to meet the argument head-on by producing contrary readings of the same patristic sources, or to entirely undermine it by softening its conclusions. I presume this would still be the instinctive reaction of the average Orthodox reader. I find this kind of response not conducive to ecumenical dialogue. Let me then probe here something new. In what follows, I want to explore the possibility of appreciating the argument of the book on its own merits, while maintaining at the same time the full cogency of the Orthodox contrary position. This is obviously a response that requires argumentative effort. However, if it can work, it will be extremely rewarding since it will result in a very powerful reading of the book from an ecumenical perspective, or so I want to argue. Now, the argument for the filioque runs like a thread through the book and is beautifully summarized in less than a page in the conclusions. Let me here try my own brief version of it. To my understanding, the argument goes something like this. Scriptural revelation attests that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The doctrine is confirmed by the pro-Nicene Church Fathers, especially regarding the temporal missions of the Son and the Spirit in the economy of salvation, namely ad extra. All the actions of the Trinity ad extra must in some way reflect or reveal the immanent life of the Trinity ad intra. The Church Fathers, especially Augustine, appeal to the psychological analogy in order to show how the temporal missions also reveal the eternal processions. It follows that temporal missions reflect the eternal processions. The Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son both internally and externally. The filioque is then the correct interpretation of the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. Thomas Aquinas grounds theologically this interpretation in a twofold way. Regarding theological language, the modus significanti, he prioritizes the use of analogy over metaphor. Regarding the thing signified, the res significata, he theorizes the divine persons as subsistent relations instead of causal derivations. The book suggests that the above argument does not hinder ecumenical dialogue. It is claimed that the basic premise of the filioque, namely the idea that the temporal missions of the Son and Spirit in economy truly indicate to us the processions of the persons in their eternal relations of origin, is shared between Eastern and Western theologians. Thus, several places of consensus arise, which are sufficient for mutual confession of the Trinitarian faith and ecclesial intercommunion. At a deeper level, however, one wonders how seriously to take these claims. For let there be no misunderstanding. The book is a full-scale deconstruction project of everything that the Eastern Orthodox Trinitarian Ontology holds dear. The book claims for the Thomistic tradition the correct interpretation of the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed and of the Greek patristic tradition, with Athanasius, the Cappadocians, Dionysius, Maximus, and John Damascene as its protagonists, a move which clearly cuts off the Orthodox theologians from their patristic inheritance and the hardcore of their theological identity. In addition, the two most widely known modern Orthodox theologians are exposed for their vulnerabilities. First, the late Metropolitan of Pergamon, John Zizioulas, is praised for his extraordinary grounding of divine personhood on absolute freedom as an ontological category. In a second step, however, it is shown that Metropolitan John falls into a profound contradiction by conflating, in the case of the self-constituting of the Father as an act of free choice, ontological freedom with elective freedom. At a third and even profounder level, which is not explicitly argued but becomes, I would suggest, clear to the careful reader, the very edifice of Metropolitan John's relational ontology is shaken. By emphasizing the role of the divine unity for a correct articulation of Christian Trinitarian doctrine, namely Aquinas' De Deo et Uno treatise, the book functions as a powerful argument against the most fundamental intuition of Metropolitan John's relational theology, the thesis that the relational persons precede and in a way exceed the divine essence. Similar can be said about the critical assessment of Sergei Bulgakov. On the one hand, Bulgakov's sophiology is praised, charitably understood, for its aspiration, quote, to recover a properly Trinitarian doctrine of creation, end quote. On the other hand, it is deeply criticized for its Hegelian inspiration, which cuts it off from the De Deo et Uno dimension of Trinitarian theology, forcing it to break with the patristic tradition in radical ways. In fact, the book argues against Bulgakov's signature idea of creation as kenotic self-emptying of the divine Sophia, because the idea of a divine self-emptying contradicts several traditional divine attributes, such as simplicity, aseity, and immutability. At the end of the book, the Orthodox reader feels bewildered. The book has indeed succeeded in showing the debt of St. Thomas to the Church Fathers, and at the same time in questioning the compatibility of the Church Fathers with signature modern Orthodox doctrines. The deconstruction of the Orthodox intuitions about the Trinity is happening softly and in a language of reconciliation. The question is, what is left to reconcile after the deconstruction is completed? Up to now, I have deliberately presented the book's argument as ecumenical in language, but anti-ecumenical in substance, by reinstating the filioque as a theological normative claim. I have done so because I wanted to show how easily the book can be misunderstood for what it really aims to achieve. I now want to suggest that, in fact, the exact opposite is the case. The argument of the book works towards a real ecumenical opening from within the premises of the filioque. In order to understand and appreciate the subtlety of this move, however, I need to say a few things about the theological epistemology that underlies the argument of the book. On the one hand, the book makes recurring reference to the concept of theological schools, schools of theology or traditions of theological reflection, to signify diverse religious traditions and schools of metaphysical thought, ancient or modern. Chapter 21 is a long discussion on the differences between three such schools, the early Franciscan, the early Dominican, and the Occamist. In the end, these schools are understood in terms of successive mainstream traditions of theological reception and articulation to which scripture and tradition give rise. To my mind, this concept of theological schools as theological traditions evokes strongly the concept of traditions in the work of Alistair MacIntyre. MacIntyre speaks of traditions to denote conflicting accounts of justice by considering at length four such traditions: Aristotle's theory, Aquinas' synthesis of Aristotelianism and Augustinian Christianity, the 17th and 18th century Scottish tradition, and liberalism loosely identified with modernity. It is not a far-fetched assumption to think that Father Thomas Joseph, like MacIntyre, conceives of Thomism as such a tradition. While MacIntyre applies the concept to ethical theory, Father Thomas Joseph applies it to Trinitarian theology. There are complex issues about the cogency of MacIntyre's traditions, issues that we do not need to belabor here. But I think it is safe assumption to claim that the book on Trinity borrows from MacIntyre the language of traditions revamped as theological schools. On the other hand, the book speaks on several occasions of the grammar of theology, the grammar for God, the metaphysical grammar for what Scripture affirms, and the philosophical grammar for the biblical and dogmatic truth. On another occasion, it speaks of the language of classical diothelitism. The terminology this time evokes strongly the famous concept of language games that Ludwig Wittgenstein coined, to indicate that words acquire meaning by their use according to the social practices of which they are part. Again, there are issues about the epistemology of Wittgensteinian language games, but we do not need to consider a strong subscription of the book to the whole Wittgensteinian project. The point is that Father Thomas Joseph thinks of Thomism, Bonaventurism, Ockhamism, and so on, in terms analogous to MacIntyre's traditions and Wittgenstein's language games. They are frames of reference, each frame coming with a certain language or set of distinctive terminology, and corresponding grammar or theory of predication. All one needs to decode the epistemology of the book on Trinity is words, their use, and the realities which they signify. This is hinted at in chapter 12, which distinguishes between the mode of signification, the modus significandi, and the thing signified, the res significata. The distinction is ancient, but it is recast in light of postmodern language games and traditions as theological frames of reference. Let us now consider the import of opening statements such as, "This is a Thomistic work for Trinitarian theology," on page 6. If I am correct, the statement signals out to the reader the frame of reference in which the narrative will evolve. Its purpose is to offer a discourse on the Trinity from within a theological tradition, namely classical Thomism, with its own distinctive language, such as the divine persons as subsistent relations, and its accompanying grammar, such as the theory of analogical predication. The intention of the book is to defend the cogency of this theological frame of reference in a postmodern context. Quote, "In regard to Aquinas specifically, I presume for the most part that his reflections on the nature of God and the Trinity are true and defensible," end quote. If indeed we can read the book from the backdrop of such epistemological premises, then we must reach a different conclusion about its ecumenical impetus. For it now becomes clear that the intention of the book is not to exclude the cogency of other sound theological frames of reference with their own use of concepts and rules. This is what is alluded at behind seemingly paradoxical statements like, quote, "The claim that only Thomists can be true Catholic theologians is itself non-Thomistic and contradicts Aquinas' own criteria," end quote. If my interpretation or reinterpretation is correct, the aim of the book is not to vindicate Thomism and the Filioque over against the Orthodox East and its Trinitarian theology. It is only to vindicate the cogency of Thomism over against all sorts of criticism it has endured, including those from the East. If so, the true intention of the book is genuinely and deeply ecumenical. Quote from the introduction, "This book does argue in favor of the normative value of my positions that arise from Aquinas himself and from the Thomistic tradition." And a longer quote, this time from the conclusions, "In appealing to the Thomistic Trinitarian tradition in order to retrieve the patristic principles, and by interpreting them in a Thomistic way in the process, I am suggesting one particular way that the liveliness of the Nicene Trinitarian tradition can be received and extended into present theological discourse. Of course, what I have presented in this book is only one proposal of a Thomistic pathway forward in modern theology, not an attempt to provide a normative declaration of dogmatic definitions. In brackets, theologians who want to live in the church with others need to learn to distinguish ecclesial dogma from schools of theology. Brackets close. Nevertheless, the quote continues, everyone must seek to think about what he or she believes about God in our modern context. And in this regard, I am arguing that Thomism is a helpful guide for thinking about the contemporary relevance of Athanasius, Gregory of Nazianzus, Augustine, and Dionysius as expositors of Nicene Trinitarianism. End quote. What is particularly striking in the above quote, and from an ecumenical point of view particularly welcoming and refreshing, is a distinction between ecclesial dogma and schools of theology. Each school of theology entails a modus significandi, which is to say that each theological frame of reference develops its own language game. Thomism is such a frame of reference, and the Filioque is part of its language game. Eastern Orthodoxy is another frame of reference, and the affirmation of the ex patre, ec tu patros only, is part of its language game. What is important in both cases is that the res significata, the Trinity itself, remains the same. Here I want to ask, is the res significata the same as the ecclesial dogma? I want to argue that in one sense it is, but in another it is not. In using different terms and concepts, or in using the same terms and concepts differently, alternative theological languages give rise to alternative meanings. It is one thing to say that both the Thomistic and the Orthodox traditions speak of the same Trinity, and another thing to say that they speak of the Trinity in the same sense. The Filioque and the rejection of it cannot amount to the same meaning. The meaning of each theological language depends not only on the cogency of its terms, but also from their use, the associations and connotations that emerge from the use of language. When a Thomist and an Orthodox speak of the Trinity, one using the language of Filioque and the other denying it, they may be speaking about the same Trinity, but they do not mean exactly the same. Father Thomas Joseph makes this point gently but firmly. Quote, Trinitarian theology in the Thomistic tradition does tend to emphasize certain central interpretive tenets, such as the notion of the persons in God as subsistent relations, and does tend to evaluate the antecedent and subsequent tradition in light of such notions. Every school of theology creates hermeneutical points of emphasis of this kind, as does every theologian, however latently, who reflects on such matters. Nevertheless, one can present what one takes to be a conceptually advantageous principle of interpretation of patristic Trinitarian traditions, such as the notion of subsistent relations derived from Thomism, while also acknowledging that in principle, notions from this same early tradition can be received and interpreted in alternative ways. End quote. This is then how I propose to understand the deep structure of the book. In its 34 chapters, it unfolds stage by stage the Thomistic grammar of Christian Trinitarian doctrine. Necessary component of this theological grammar is the language of the Filioque. The introduction and the conclusions of the book, however, contextualize the language of the Filioque within a broader epistemological framework of alternative theological grammars, like that of the Eastern Orthodox. Necessary component of the Orthodox theological grammar is the stress on the generation of the Spirit in the immanent life of the Trinity only from the Father, the ex patre, ec tu patros language. Both languages express the same ecclesial dogma of the Trinity, though not in exactly the same way. It is this difference in theological language, a difference in meaning, that the book aims to vindicate over against valid but alternative theological schools. This is clearly not anymore a difference in doctrine, but in the articulation of the doctrine. Eastern and Western Trinitarian theologians do not draw from different sources. Scripture, the Nicene Creed, and its patristic interpretation belong to the shared inheritance of Christian theology, East and West. It is only the case, Father Thomas Joseph playfully suggests, that the Thomists are able to express this common inheritance just a bit better. With these remarks, I believe that the profound ecumenical impetus of the book has been revealed, and my promise to Father Giulio has been to a large extent fulfilled. I believe, however, that the ecumenical assessment of the argument of the book will remain incomplete, as long as I do not explain, albeit very schematically and briefly, something of the Eastern Orthodox intuitions about the Trinity and the Filioque. Do I have the time to do that, or shall I stop here? Okay, wonderful. Now, in this last bit of my paper, then, I will argue that in his magisterial exposition of the patristic doctrine on the Trinity from within Thomistic premises, the book makes a significant, perhaps slightly exaggerated concession that threatens the cogency of its own argument. If explored, the concession will help us understand better the Trinitarian intuitions of the East. It is to this that I now turn. As someone who has spent the last 10 years of his life working on ancient theories of light and their patristic appropriation, I was a bit surprised to observe that the book underplays significantly the role of the sun-light analogy in the formation and explanation of the Nicene doctrine. Those who have studied Athanasius and the Cappadocians know quite well that one of the most important analogies used by the pro-Nicene fathers in their effort to capture in human language, however imperfectly, the generation of the Son from the Father and their consubstantiality is that of the sun and its light. In fact, there are two analogies that appear in the sources. The first is that of the sun and its ray. The second is that of the sun and its luminous aura, often translated as brightness, based on passages such as Wisdom 7:26 and Hebrews 1:3. It is these two analogies that underlie the creedal formula, light from light, and which Athanasius, Gregory of Nazianzen, and Gregory of Nyssa take extra care to explain in a pro-Nicene way in their anti-Arian and anti-Eunomian writings. Interestingly, the creedal formula, light from light, appears in chapter 7 of the book on the Trinity, but does not become part of the narrative until chapter 22, where it reappears, to be cited occasionally until the conclusions, but in my humble opinion, without ever receiving the close examination that the psychological analogy does. The analogy from light is thus never organically integrated or properly investigated in the book. This silence seems intentional. In exploring the analogical language, the book distinguishes between two kinds of analogies. Analogies of immanent activity, like knowledge and love, and analogies of transitive activity, like wood catching fire, fire and heat, or, tellingly, the sun transmitting heat and light to plants and animals. Only analogies of immanent activity are deemed theologically suitable to explain the immaterial procession of the Son and the Spirit in the inner life of the Trinity, since God is immaterial and does not have any potency for development. Analogies of transitive activity, which describe the actualization of a potency, are more suitable to denote the causal production of the world by God. As a result, the analogy of light is eclipsed from the Trinitarian narrative because of the materiality that it is assumed that it implies. Quote, "There are only two immaterial activities in human creatures, those of understanding and love." And another quote, "There are only two analogies to immaterial procession we can make, one from knowledge and the other from love." And tellingly, quote, "Therefore, if there are two truly distinct persons who proceed in God, who are intelligible only in light of the analogy of immanent activity by way of immaterial procession, then they will be intelligible only by similitude to immaterial understanding and love, respectively. The conclusion one can draw from this stark claim is twofold. On the one hand, we do truly have a proper analogy by which to understand the mystery of the immanent Trinitarian life of God. On the other, we have no others. End quote. I find the latter conclusion a bit extravagant, for it would have sufficed to pay close attention to the passage from Athanasius quoted on chapter 7, to realize that the analogy from light is understood from the Church Fathers in immaterial terms, like an activity of the mind. Here is how the Athanasian passage from the Contra Arianos concludes. Quote, Scripture speaks of Son in order to herald the natural and true offspring of his essence. And on the other hand, that none may think of the offspring humanly while signifying his essence, it also calls him word, wisdom, and radiance, to teach us that the generation was impassible and eternal and worthy of God. End quote. The Greek term for radiance is apavrasma, and the reference is to Wisdom 7:26 and Hebrews 1:3, as already mentioned. Now, it would be the topic of a fascinating but different paper to explain in detail how and why light is treated here as a quasi-immaterial analogy. Let me just say, drawing from the findings of my own past research, that in antiquity, light is theorized as the most immaterial of all physical substances. Being itself quasi-immaterial, it demarcates the borders between the intelligible and the sensible world. It is because of its immateriality that Aristotle uses it in a famous passage in the De Anima, Book 3, Chapter 5, as an analogy for the active intellect. Aristotle's analogy of the mind in terms of light is important for several reasons. Firstly, it is a rendition of the celebrated analogy of the sun in the 6th book of Plato's Republic, where the sun functions as a symbol of the good and light as a symbol of the truth derived from the good, like the light springs out of the sun as its undiminished natural power. Secondly, because a few lines later, vital heat is introduced by Plato as a second power of the sun, similar in nature to light, with the exception that it does not cause knowledge of things, as light does, but their very existence and essence to generation, growth, and nurture. And thirdly, because it is the very same passage in which Plato declares that the good itself is not essence, but still transcends essence, epekinatis ousias, in dignity and surpassing power. In terms of reception history, the two similes of light, Plato's sun simile in the Republic and Aristotle's simile of mind qua light in the De Anima, will have a tremendous impact on the formation of the early Christian doctrine. The Greek fathers will find in Plato's sun simile an analogical model for divine transcendence, while at the same time they will identify Aristotle's active intellect with the God of the 12th book of the Metaphysics, the famous thought thinking itself, which will serve as an analogical model for the Trinity. There are thus two analogical models of light that underlie early Christian Trinitarian reflection: the sun simile and the mind simile, both of them conceived in terms of light. It is a fascinating episode of Western intellectual history, how the Church Fathers claimed the two similes back from the Arian and Eunomian camps, integrating them into the pro-Nicene theological grammar that took shape after the 360s in the writings of Athanasius and the Cappadocians. As I said, it is not my intention to narrate here this episode. It suffices to mention that once purged from their heretical use, the two similes of light were recast in a Christian language to denote the economic mission of the Son and the Spirit in creation as the Son's light and heat, and the immanent life of the Trinity as thinking thought. Interestingly, and for us perhaps confusingly, the language of light from light applies to both similes. It now becomes clear that in prioritizing the psychological analogy, which is half of the unified pro-Nicene analogy of light, the book on the Trinity risks missing out its other half, that of light and heat as two equipotent powers of the sun. It is not difficult to perceive that once Eastern and Western theologians were divided into opposite theological schools, each one developing their own grammar of the Trinity, the one camp prioritized the Aristotelian model and the other the Platonic. In breaking down the once unified analogy and appropriating a half, each camp missed something from the original unified vision of the early church. Western theologians quieted down the language of non-relational equipollence of the Son and the Spirit, as described in the analogy of light and heat in the Platonic sun simile, while Eastern theologians quieted down the language of absolute relationality that is part and parcel of the Aristotelian divine reality as thought thinking itself. I say deliberately quieted down and not lost, because both traditions retain the original unified vision in their secret reservoirs. In the West, the light and heat analogy was always accessible through its Augustinian reinterpretation as knowledge and love. In the East, the psychological analogy remained always accessible through the Origenian tradition and its emphasis on God the Father as nous, intellect. Instead of a conclusion, let me here pass aloud how the above reflections fit in the broader framework of Father Thomas Joseph's book. In the last 1,000 years, East and Western theologians have formed distinct theological traditions or schools with their own distinctive Trinitarian languages. The two languages are that of the ex patre, ek tu patros, in the East, and that of the filioque in the West. The underlying grammar, however, I want to suggest is common. It is the language of analogy, as Father Thomas repeatedly suggests, though it is also true that the interplay of analogy, metaphor, proper and equivocal predication takes different shapes in the writings of the Greek Church Fathers and the writings of St. Thomas. Different, but not incompatible. What is radically different is the meaning of the Trinitarian language that Eastern and Western theologians currently employ. With Father Thomas Joseph, I too want to claim that the mode of procession of the Trinity in creation, the economic missions of the Son and the Spirit, must reveal something of the mode of the eternal processions of the Son and the Spirit in the immanent life of the Trinity. What it is that they reveal, however, is differently understood in East and West. In the ex patre language, the Son and the Spirit are generated and spirated like the two productive powers of Plato's sun, namely light and heat. In the filioque language, the Son and the Spirit proceed like the thought springs from the mind, always remaining united with it through their common thinking activity, as Aristotle intimated, Augustine developed, and Thomas further explained. These are two different theological grammars, a grammar of causal, non-reflexive relations, and a grammar of reflexive subsistent relations. The meaning of the Trinitarian procession in these languages is therefore different. But difference in meaning is not necessarily a bad thing. To quote a remarkable passage from Father Thomas Joseph's book, every school of theology creates hermeneutical points of emphasis of this kind, as does every theologian, however latently, who reflects on such matters. End quote. The question is it possible to regard the two theological languages of the Trinity as mutually compatible without asking them to denounce their own identity as theological traditions? I believe it is. For both languages are derived from the common language of prepositional metaphysics of the first 1,000 years, according to which the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, a patre per filium. Different theological traditions, East and West, may unpack the meaning of this common scriptural and patristic inheritance differently. However, this is only a difference in meaning, stemming from the modus significandi, and not a difference in substance, arising from a divergence in the res significata. To quote Father Thomas Joseph again, the advantage of a notion of theological schools is that it allows one to acknowledge the deeper ground of unity among theologians that emerges from the Church's common confession of faith, while also arguing for constructive debate, disagreement, convergence, or consensus within a shared culture of reflection, end quote. If Father Thomas Joseph is right, ecumenical dialogue can no longer be about a chimeric quest for doctrinal superiority of one theological tradition over the other. Instead, it must be about the creation of a different culture of theological engagement from within the shared space of the Church's common confession of faith. Ecumenical dialogue requires a deep sense of unity in diversity. The unity between Trinitarian theologies in East and West lies in their common patristic heritage. Their diversity lies in their alternative interpretations of that common patristic past. In retrieving the normative value of the Filioque, Father Thomas Joseph White forces his Orthodox readers to consider how seriously they want to take ecumenism. His is not a piecemeal solution where a part of Orthodoxy can converse with a part of Thomism. His is instead a bold vision of uncompromising ecumenism, in which any part of Orthodoxy can converse with any part of Thomism, without any part having to negotiate its theological identity or tradition. The only requirement is that every part proceed in a spirit of collegiality and of love of truth. For offering us such a powerful vision of unity in uncompromised diversity, we owe him our deepest gratitude.
Thank you very much, Father Isidoro, for this very careful presentation, very detailed presentation of Father White's book on the Trinity, and just the effort made there to try to ensure that our reflection on the Trinity would provide us more and more, day by day, to a closer, more living unity among all Christians. So please God, that will be the fruit of the work of Father White, but also the work that you're doing. In other words, that dialogue is exactly what we need.